Volume 2 Chapter 29. Ogres, why are there ogres? Prince Barbaro shouted to his staff. The half-a-dozen noble sons had no clear answer. They stared around at one another and at their prince as dumbfounded as he was angry. Outside, soldiers were eating their rations and setting up the tents nobody thought would be needed for a fight nobody thought they would really face. The few casters that came along had run out of mana already. The priest or two intended to tend to the spiritual needs of the army had run dry also. So, some bled to death. Some infections festered, and some wailed in pain while they were bandaged, and had to be given copious amounts of alcohol to ease the pain. With respect, my prince, what matters is that they are here, a mustached nobleman said, gesturing toward the exit of the tent that faced the walled village. Barbaro ground his teeth, but the man wasn't wrong. He shot his gaze down toward the one who dared to speak. Better armor than most, it was an obvious clue that he came from a prosperous family. Prince Barbaro's estimation of him went up another notch. You're right. The prince looked away from the sandy-haired noble. Though the flap to their command tent was closed, he could practically feel the silent walls sneering at him. It's strange, isn't it, how silent they are? There was a general rumble of agreement, and the prince turned away from the flap and back down to the table they surrounded. At least we know the layout now. Our best bet seems to be to surround them. Prince Barbaro pointed to the wall they had unsuccessfully stormed. They can't concentrate their archers everywhere, and their ogres are useless on the walls. This is still just a village. Once our soldiers are on the wall, we'll hit the ogres with spears, surround them, and bring them down one by one. Their walls will be our safety. A series of approving nods followed. At least they don't have more than one magic caster. Prince Barbaro added, those are more trouble than I thought. He stroked his beard. Have some of our soldiers make ladders all night. We'll delay the fight until tomorrow afternoon, and if they try that trick with the ogres again, we'll use cavalry with long spears. It was a sound enough, and simple enough plan that the command staff could think of little to improve it. Fucking trash, Barbaro muttered when he stormed out of the tent, his feet squelching in the mud all the way back to his own space. The red and gold-clad prostitute was already cowering in the corner. Get over here, Lake Hughes, he spat into the muck, and waited for her to obey. Henry sat around the table with the former Swords of Darkness, her husband, Britta, and Jugum. That went well, their would-be queen said with a tight smile. It did, but tomorrow will be harder. They know they have to try now. They'll surround us. They have numbers on their side. Peter shuddered. I hate being outnumbered. Who likes it? Lucrute asked with a full shoulder shrug. The fact is we hurt them, bad. There has to be 200 dead out there, and they've been staring at a village that casually exterminates offensive people and sends demon screams overhead. That'll rattle any ordinary heart, he said and put his feet up onto the table before leaning back in his chair. Nina frowned. I guess, but I was just remembering something Lupu taught me. She said confusion stops every intention. We're not surrounded yet. We can get some Alamias out our back gate in the dark. They can slither on the ground like snakes, and really fast. We don't need a lot, we just need to make one side break and run, then we can hold the other two. If the left runs, the front will see it and they'll break. Then we can outnumber the remaining side. All that's fine, Jugum remarked and reached for his mug, but how much longer do you think this will go on? Eventually they will get in, then what? Nobody wanted to think about that. Henry reached for the little horn that hung from around her neck. Her slender, rough peasant hands closed around the smooth surface. I can use this again, a dozen more swords couldn't hurt to have, but... Nfaya placed a hand on Henry's shoulder. We should save it, if we have to evacuate the children, some fresh swords might stand a better chance at getting them to the forest. Henry didn't answer, but Britta quickly filled the silence. Look, we need to attack, right now we're just taking what they have to throw at us. I say we attack, hit them hard. If we put their supplies to the torch tonight, then they have no choice but to leave when they fail tomorrow. Right, remember that time we got trapped in those ruins? How much longer would we have lasted if we hadn't found a hidden passage? Peter gave a deep, grim laugh that didn't really suit the usually cheerful-faced young man. Not long. Not long at all. Lucrute replied, it's a good idea, we have the equipment for it, and it looks like rain tonight. So let's give it a few hours and we'll take some volunteers. The thunder that rolled overhead outside seemed to endorse the plan, and planning turned to idle chatter. until even that died away and the sound of pouring rain began in earnest. Prince Zanak grunted when he got down off of his horse and went to his tent. He was walking bow-legged, and his entire body was sore, but still, he did what he could to keep some dignity about himself. He didn't reach around his rotund body to arch his back until after he was alone. However, as soon as he had his privacy, he let out a long, drawn-out groan and shook his head with the vigor of a wet dog. How does water get under a helmet? Prince Zanak cast himself and ran his fingers through his hair. His soaked gloves did little good, and he slowly peeled himself out of his armor. Servants would normally have been expected, he knew his brother had them. But the very thought made the prince uncomfortable. He's always looked better than I have. He got father's body, I got father's brain. If only he had 1 ounce of loyalty in that muscle-bound body of his, we might have been able to reach some kind of an accord. Prince Zanak cursed his brother and kicked his boots away. 4 villages. What a waste. The prince cursed. A part of him felt the swelling empathy and urge to vomit over the gruesome sights his brother left behind, but at the core of it all was his contempt for his stupid older brother's infantile destructive nature. Just like when we were boys and he broke my toy sword after his broke. He hasn't grown even a little in all that time. What he did to climb, I know my sister never forgave him. How petty. It's chilling to know how far she'll go for revenge though. My brother will never take the throne after this. But maybe Climb should know what he's getting into. That at least was a comforting thought, and it eased his mind when the fat prince lay back on his cot and fell promptly into an exhausted sleep to the constant pitter-patter sound of rapidly falling rain. Brito and Lucrute ran over the field as fast as they could. In the new armor they'd been given, it was a shockingly easy thing to do, so much lighter and stronger than what they wore before. At their backs were 6 goblins and 6 peasants. All of them were armed with bows, swords, and carried bottles of burnable alcohol as well as flint. The peasants knew the way best, and were able to guide them the long way to the forest by following the river. The rushing water provided ample cover as nobody would go too close to it in the driving rain, fearful of slipping in and drowning. However, under the watchful eyes of those born to the village, navigating the way safely and avoiding the risk of slipping into the raging waters was child's play. Britta felt her breathing become shallow as the moment drew closer. Step followed squelching step, the blades of grass were crushed underfoot, and the circuitous route, though it took ample time, provided them with relative safety. The cover of rain and darkness and their total lack of torchlight provided greater security, but their finest cover was the doubts of their enemies. Thinking the raid unthinkable had made the impossible raid possible. Confidence that at least in camp they were secure, the guards were few. Lucrute crouched down, his sharp eyes piercing the veil of water falling constantly from the sky. His hand went smoothly to the arrow and drew it back on the wet slick string. He took slow, deep breaths, narrow eyes focused, acutely aware of the ones at his back. Then there was nothing. Nothing but him, his arrow, and his targets. They were young men, shivering beneath thick green wool cloaks and resting lazily on spears. They stood close to share warmth that the rain would have sapped away. He waited still, then a great roll of thunder hit the world below from the sky above. In an instant, Lucrute's fingers opened and the first arrow left the bow. Another came immediately after. The 2 arrows hit their targets in their throats before either realized the other had been hit as well. Wide, disbelieving eyes looked into the impenetrable raining dark for a killer they would never spot, and they splashed down into the grass before the noise of thunder faded. Lucrute made a fist, and the 14 rushed into the gap. Britta took the lead as soon as they stepped over the bodies of the fallen. Lucrute fell back. Late as it was, few would be out and about, and those were barely aware of anything, making it easy to avoid danger. Once again, Lucrute looked at the former iron-ranked adventurer with a mix of curiosity and respect. How she knows her way around a camp like this. I'll have to ask her someday. Britta pointed to an area where a little glow of flame could still be seen winking in the darkness. They ran a long way, stopping behind every tent, avoiding the few guards who mostly grumbled to one another or ignored everything in favor of keeping their heads down and their hoods pulled tight in the futile battle against the downpour. Then they were there. A series of tents erected in a row, a pair of guards in front of each entrance. 4 to a tent, they slit the backs of the tents and crept in on their own individually. Britta looked over her own. It was pitch dark, but that proved no obstacle. Her hands did the seeing for her, no worse than any dungeon. Though Lucrete is probably seeing just fine. I swear, that guy. Against her will a little sardonic smile formed, that guy is something else. She roamed her hand over the barrels and sacks, rattling things lightly as she searched for anything flammable to further add to the conflagration she intended to create. Lamp oil, pitch, anything that would serve her ends. Her sardonic expression grew almost ecstatic when she heard the rattling of glass vials. Aha! She waited until the thunder rolled again, and popped the top off the small box. She shoved the tip of the bottle between her teeth, bit down on the cork, and pulled it open. She took a sniff to confirm the contents, and began to pour it over grain, meat, vegetables, everything she could, casting the bottle all over the various stored goods. Then she reached for the bottle she carried, yanked the cork, spat it on the ground, and shoved a dry rag into the hole. It stood upright on a box while she pulled her flint out of its pouch and began smacking the stones together. A spark jumped to life at the sharp cracking strike of stone to stone, and it caught the dry cloth. The fire leapt to life, the offspring of the spark illuminating the grinning face of the red-haired Britta. She snatched up the bottle, raised it overhead, and threw it hard against a barrel full of grain. It shattered with a crashing noise, and the offspring of the flame became an all-consuming inferno. Protected from the saving rain, the flame spread unchecked while Britta made her escape out the back. Even the laziest of guards weren't going to miss that. Elsewhere in the same large tent, the trio of goblins to enter with her, finished their objectives and rushed out the same way. It was far, far too late for subtlety now as the shouts went up in earnest. "Run for it," Britta shouted over the rain, and the 14 began to sprint. "To arms! To arms!" Guards shouted, and like a swarm of bees whose nest had been disturbed, swords flashed out and caught the flashing lightning. The little band of impromptu raiders was then forced to fight. Britta felt the whistle of air and the screaming noise of Lucrete's arrow as it rushed past her ear and lodged into an unfortunate face. Their new equipment was put to the hardest of tests, and Britta grunted as a sword thrust toward her gut knocked the wind out of her and sent her sprawling back into the mud, but to both her surprise and that of the soldier who struck her, there was no blood or death. For a brief moment, they each looked at each other with stupid faces. In his face Britta felt she could read his mind. "You're breaking the rules, you're supposed to be dead." He was still wearing that face when she rolled forward, and with a banshee cry she ran her sword through his iron armor like it was paper and shoved him to lie dying in the grass. "Go! Go!" Lucrete shouted as they made their way toward the forest. Behind her the sound of soldiers fighting the blaze was fading, but the noise around them as other opponents appeared, only continued. "But father, I don't want to sit around and do nothing. I want to go out there and see the world," Britta recalled saying to her old man in their pathetic excuse for a hovel. "Bah! Just tend the farm." His glib dismissal of Britta's dreams only fueled her determination, and that year she'd snuck off to Irantal to pretend to be a part of the levy for the army. "Just one time taking the knights charged with those scared boys, I knew I'd rather face monsters. Now here I am again. Only I'm killing those same boys because they're the monsters. What a bitch this world is." Britta cursed and swung her sword. An enemy head went flying into the darkness and the body toppled with a thud she never saw. But they kept coming. The goblins fought like maniacs, stronger than the average soldier. Each one took on 2 or 3, and then 5 or 6, the improved equipment giving them an advantage over the more crudely armored soldiers. A shriek off to her right caught her attention. One of the peasants took a spear to the face, and a goblin took a sword through the ear that sprouted out the other side of his head. So close. She scrambled on. The way they'd come would lead them into the forest. Pursuit would become dangerous or impossible soon. A little more. "Hurry up," Lucrete shouted from up ahead. He'd whirled on them, firing arrow after arrow into those who threatened to close in around their little band. "Just die," Britta roared and tackled one of the soldiers who raised an axe with both hands. They rolled over and over on the slippery grass. The gap was widened, and both peasants and goblins brushed past. Britta raised her blade when she rolled on top of the soldier. He raised a hand and screamed into the night, her face twisted in wrath and illuminated by a flash of lightning at her back. Lucrete bellowed into the rain, "Hurry up, Britta." Even for his eyes, the dark and the rain were not as bright as day, but in that flash of lightning that lasted several seconds, he saw the growing numbers closing in. The forest was close, but every second counted. "Hurry up," he roared and drew a light dagger. He flung it full force, spinning end over end, It pierced the eye of a soldier close to where Britta was rising to her feet. She glanced behind her, and Lucrut felt his stomach drop. Adventuring is the way to go. Britta recalled the thought, camaraderie. A team, not just a bunch of cowards, and nobody's orders but the ones we all take. Only to find, no, we don't take women. The bitter words were ashes even now. She took up the weapon in the hands of the man who lay dead beneath her and flung it into another. Britta. She heard Lucrut's voice behind her, and despite herself, she glanced back his way. The lightning was gone, only rain and dark, and she couldn't see that far. She yanked the knife out of the face of the man Lucrut killed, and squared herself off in front of the host of foes. As if they sensed her resolve and it was a weapon all its own, they hesitated. In that moment, Britta screamed out her defiance and ran at them, away from the woods and into the forest of blades. Her sword sang as it never had before, her armor fended off so many blows that she should have died a dozen times before she did. She swung and swung until her fingers ran slick with blood and the knife slipped from grasp when it lodged into an unfortunate face. She felt the blade that went into her armpit, and the blade that pierced her thigh. Still she swung the sword with her other hand, till she was down on her knees, and with it raised up for one more blow, swaying in the rain like one of the wind-swept trees into which her friends had gone, her sword came down again. Then a spear found its mark in her eye, and so, Britta died. Volume 2 Chapter 30. Lucrut watched the red-haired woman's glowering face, the moment of her resolve. I'll buy you time. Just go. She never said a word, but she wore the face of someone that had said the same exact thing when he was younger and dumber. God damn it. He cursed when she put her back to him. He reached for his sword. Go with her. Go on. Coward. Trash. He cursed his unmoving feet, but even as he cursed himself, he knew it was futile. She was already doing what she had to do. All you can do now by going out with her, is insult her one more time. He knew it, and spun around to run into the forest. The fading cries of Britta, her victims and her killers were swallowed up by the storm and distance alike as Lucrut and the survivors vanished into the darkness of the forest. When morning came on, Prince Barbro could only stare in mute horror that was contained behind a mask of rage. Dozens more dead, but that was meaningless. What really mattered was the lost supplies. A village. A goddamn village. The throne looked farther away than ever before. At least we didn't lose the ladders we built. He thought and turned his head when he heard someone call for him. My prince, we've recovered 3 bodies, 2 humans and a goblin. A trio of soldiers lined up and knelt beside the dead they dragged over. Barbro could barely believe it. He chewed on his tongue and looked down beside the kneeling soldiers. They weren't wrong. A human female, a human male, and a goblin. What kind of armor is that? Prince Barbro's instincts for equipment were sound at least, and he knelt to touch the leathery covering over the woman's breast. It screamed expensive. How could mere peasant trash have this? Why are there goblins and trolls, and it just doesn't make sense. Barbro's fingers ran over the dark armor and noticed something else. Give me your sword, he snapped and held out a hand. Yes, sire? The soldier startled, snapping his head up at the unexpected order. Your sword, idiot, Barbro demanded and flexed his powerful fingers. Ah, yes of course. The young soldier drew the steel and handed it to his prince. Barbro took it by the hilt, stood up over the woman, held the blade in both hands, and began to drive the tip of the sword towards her gut. The armor gave, but the sword didn't pierce. He thrust again and again and again as if he hated her personally. The red-haired woman's corpse, however, did not suffer another wound. Damn it! Barbro cursed. Damn it! Damn it! Damn it! He began kicking the corpse of the red-haired woman that lay at his feet. How do you do it? How do you do it? He shouted at the corpses as if they could speak. The sun was slowly drifting through the vanishing clouds and it caught the faces of the dead. They were peaceful, all of them. It made the prince hate them more. Strip the corpses and bind them to long stakes. Prince Barbro ordered, let them enjoy a little visual about their action last night. The walls fall today. Oh, and bring her armor to me. It's unthinkable that peasant garbage should have better armor than the Prince of Riestais. He then returned to his tent. Henry was walking the wall with Nthea and Nina first thing in the morning, which was why she was among the first to see it when the army began to advance again. The wings of the army arrayed against her village began to spread out, just like Peter and Nina had suggested they would try to do. But what no one had said was what lengths the unknown leader of the kingdom army would go to in order to terrify the people of Kani. Nfia and Nina and she squinted at first. It was a cross of some sort, but what was on it wasn't clear at first. Not until the rehorsed enemy commander began to draw close. Not until they saw the red hair. Henry's eyes began to well up with tears, her hands drew up and covered her mouth, her fingers trembled with shock. "Oh no," she whispered. "Have they no mercy? Even in death?" Nfia uttered as he looked on. Peter's jaw clenched tight and he sucked in air through his teeth. There, bound to the cross by ropes at wrists and ankles, was the naked corpse of Britta. "Surrender. Or this will happen to all of you," the prince called out. "Your little raid failed. Everyone is dead. This is just one of them. We sure had fun with her first. She just kept screaming how sorry she was." Prince Barbaro lied to the wall. "Was that to you? Was that to me? Come out here and ask her yourself." Henry began to shake, she leaned forward and began to breath harder and harder. Her hand fell on Nfia's shoulder. And all that carefully constructed plan. It was forgotten in an instant. "Attack!" Henry screamed the order with rage she hadn't felt since soldiers mocked her hopeless effort at saving her sister's life. Behind the wall, the sally call was echoed with a roar of confidence. Riding high on yesterday's victory, driven by a sudden rush of hatred that took the place of terror, people rushed into place, the gate opened, and the trolls began their charge. Henry snatched up her banner as Peter, Nina, and Nfia rushed after her. They grabbed the nearest horses and flung themselves into place. "This is either a terrible idea, or a really good one," Nina thought as she slung her leg up over the saddle. "Master's leveling might not have changed me much. But it'll be good enough to burn a few of these bastards." Lupu's words hung in her mind, "If you just let it happen, you deserve whatever you get." The woman might have been a monster, but she couldn't argue against it now. Not now. Prince Barbaro watched them sally out. "Remember, aim for faces. We can't count on getting through their armor." The stampede was above and beyond what he expected. The trolls would pose a problem, and by all reports the goblins were kind of tough, but... He stopped, the couple on the horse holding the unknown banner. The blonde, she was holding up a horn. He furrowed his brow. "Are there more?" he wondered just as somebody announced a threat. Sweeping in from the distance, a dozen or so rapidly slithering monsters. Nagas. Why are there Nagas? He felt a rising sense of terror, a sixth sense to danger that had let him survive countless times. He pointed toward the charging couple on the horse. "Kill those. Fire your arrows, kill them. Kill them. Don't let her use that." Barbaro shrieked. Arrows flew from bows in a long graceful arc. A blue light spread out from the man holding the reins, and arrows bounced away. "Magic." Barbaro cursed, and the noise of the horn surpassed the thunder of the previous night's sky. It rang out over the land like it was calling all the world to battle. Then, it was gone. And a new thunder took its place. Pounding feet. Barbaro looked to his left. Heavily armored warriors were advancing with halberds down in perfect posture. Behind them, he caught glimpses of magic casters, and an arc of fireballs soared through the air. Screams began as they erupted among his unwary formation. "Cavalry! Cavalry!" Barbaro shouted and pointed toward the advance on the left wing. Horsemen charged, only for a howl to drown out their hooves as if it were one giant wolf. Only for him to see them by the hundreds racing past the heavy infantry. Goblin wolf riders. And the massive wolves, nearly the size of horses themselves, tore into the throats of the poor dull beasts that men rode. The whinnying scream of horses ripped from dying throats, and the blood of horses stained the churned-up earth. The blood and screams of their riders were quick to follow. "Attack! Stop them!" Prince Barbaro ordered his army to advance and fight. His heart quivered and broke, his courage poured out the cracks, and he spurred his horse away. As his soldiers had nowhere to go but into the fight, they charged with determined shouts. The left flank crumpled almost instantly. The front, which he rode behind, was not lasting long either. The strange armor of the raiders were not the only sets. Angry and hateful faces seemed everywhere he looked. The blonde woman holding the banner and sword aloft yelled her hatred after him, while at her flanks a pair of casters sent acid, arrows, and fire into a rapidly collapsing front. "I have to run. I have to live." Prince Barbaro thought, all desire for the throne replaced by the desire for just one more minute of life. The thunder of his horse's hooves underfoot was the only sound he wanted to hear, and little by little, the sound of fighting behind him began to fade away. Peter watched with horror as the cross-holding Brita's body fell forward and landed in the mud. But before he could do anything about it, he had the living to contend with. Armed with weapons that Orichalcum warriors would envy, protected by armor they could spend years searching for and not find the equal of, he cut a swath through the ranks of soldiers that defied imagination. Blasts of magic seared him with heat when it consumed those around him. Sweat ran down his body like a river. He felt the blows of spears and swords from too many to count, but other than scrapes and cuts on his arms, his body, it seemed, was all but untouchable. He smashed his shield out, and a scream resounded from someone whose arm Peter had just shattered. He spun and thrust his sword down, cutting off the scream without seeing whom he'd killed. His every martial art was in play, but the battle was over before it began. The army of Kani, backed by their unexpected reinforcements, was swallowing up the lives of the remaining forces of the kingdom. The foul smell of sweat, fear, and death hung in their noses, but it was a comfort to Nina, seeing the oppressors crushed. Hatred in the eyes of villagers who had fled before and did not want to flee again, offered strength and resolve. Not far away, trolls that found themselves surrounded, found the villagers they lived with, breaking up formations that should have brought them down. Impromptu formations allowed the trolls to advance while villagers fended off attempts at encirclement. It was over in minutes. Shouts of victory crashed over the woods. Some of the defeated soldiers had obviously fled within, but were not pursued. Let them die there, Henry thought, and raised her banner up for the entire field to cheer for. Peter was flipping over the fallen cross to which Brita's body was still bound. Most of the corpse was now battered and broken, that much was obvious as soon as he flipped the wood over to land with a red splash into the ground. "Do we need prisoners, Your Majesty?" Peter asked, staring down at the once vibrant woman. "No," Henry answered. "Good," he responded. "But we do need to chase down survivors." Nina added, "We should start checking the tents that are still up, maybe we can find something useful. We won this one, but Lupu told me that it doesn't matter if you win 100 battles if you lose in the end because you're ignorant." "Fine, do that. I sent some wolf riders after the ones who fled on horseback," Henry replied and jammed her banner into the ground. "My king, should we go see our people?" Henry asked Nfia, who wiped sweat from his brow and gave her a weak, exhausted smile. "Why yeah, let's do that," he said through heavy, worn-out breaths. Nina left them to do that, while she herself went straight for the commander's tent. She opened the flap and stepped inside. "Please. Please don't hurt me. I'm not a soldier. I'm not. I'm just a whore. Please. I just don't want to die." A crying voice shouted that Nina would not forget in 10,000 years. Nina's eyes went wide as saucers and she stumbled over, flipping the desk out of the way as she charged toward the sound in the back corner that lay curled up and hiding as best she could. "Please," Ty cried out, thinking the noise was of an aggressor. Ty! Ty! Nina shrieked and grabbed the hands of her sister at the wrist. She twisted the woman around. Ty froze. "My name?" she said. "My name who is?" The thought trailed off when the tantalizing voice touched a memory from another life. She let her hands come away from herself for reasons other than the tight grip she couldn't hope to break. Her tear-filled eyes turned to the slender little face of the brown-haired Nina. Then Ty's lip began to tremble as she struggled to say real words, but none came out. Nina crouched down and drew her sister's body into her embrace. "I found you. Sister. I've got you. You're safe now. I promise you." Ty lost all remaining reason, tightened her hold around her only remaining family, held her as if she were afraid Nina would vanish, and felt a sobbing that was still going when Peter came into the tent an hour later. Volume 2 Chapter 31. The tip of Clime's sword was over the throat of a poorly dressed thug. "Please. I just work for them. They're the only work to be had. That's all. I'm not a bad guy." Climb did not lower his guard. This was the third person to tell a story like that, and the last two used the moment his sword went away from their necks, to go for his own. This time, he took a deep breath. "Roll over," Climb ordered, and the shaking slender, scruffy thug obeyed with trembling, fear-filled body. The blonde young warrior went down over the body of his captive and put his sword away, then bound a captured criminal with ropes, tying the unfortunate man's hands behind his back. There was no incident this time. 4 houses down, and the day is still young, he murmured. Did you say 4 houses down? The thug stammered the question, twisting his head to the side so he could look up into Climb's face. Yes. Climb answered, standing up and wiping sweat from his brow. The warm feel of salty wetness stained his glove, and he cast his hand away, spattering it onto the floor beside his prisoner. 6 arms will. You know they'll retaliate, right? Couple raids is the cost of doing business. The thug's I'm a victim persona melted away as a sneer took over the part of his face that Climb could see. But this is like going to war, boy. His sneer was quickly replaced by a look of confusion when Climb didn't react. That confusion froze on his face. There's nobody left to lead you. The heads of every 6 arms leader were delivered to King Ramposa this morning by the adamantite Demaxel. They got everything. Names and locations for safe houses, goods, and any important members who wouldn't have been with 6 arms that evening. The king's soldiers are sweeping the whole city, and a message was even sent with relevant information to the Baharuth Emperor himself so you could be wiped out everywhere. There's nowhere left to go. You are done. The thug began to kick and thrash on the floor like a toddler throwing a tantrum until Climb grabbed him by the neck and yanked him up to his feet. It extinguished the last spark of resistance, and he meekly walked ahead of his blonde captor, sword tip at his back, and out into the daylight he went. There sat a carriage with dozens of others bound together, nor was that the only one. This is going to be a long, long day, but I think I'll call it a good one, Climb said as he helped the broken thug into the back where an armed guard would bind the captive to his fellows. Yeah, it will be. 8 Fingers got my sister addicted to black dust. I found her working as a dust whore in the last brothel we hit. May they all get the axe. The guard answered, glaring with hate down at men who would not meet his eyes. Climb had nothing to say to that. Ramposa sat at the table still staring at the heads of the 8 Fingers leadership. The heads stared at him through empty eyes, all upright on the folded-up robes of the member to leave no head behind. I am beyond impressed. You really did deliver on your promise, and you've earned your reward many times over. The old king sat with his hands folded over one another, and looked up to the adventurer team that stood a few feet away. There is only one more thing I can ask your help with. My daughter is going through the documents we seized. The corruption is far, far worse than I believed. My son. He is one of the ones involved with 8 Fingers. The king's voice was empty of emotion until he said that. The wrinkled old fist slammed down on the table. Didn't I give him everything? He was born to wealth, status, power. Even the throne was his by right of birth. But still he turns to this? Destroying his own country for what? Pocket change? The king's eyes turned dour. He stared down at the table between his hands. True rage and betrayal haunted the old man's eyes. Forgive me for unloading this on you. I shouldn't. But my eldest son is not fit to rule. I have known this since he was young. I tried to guide him properly, but he... No. It doesn't matter. King Ramposa gritted his teeth. Everyone responsible for involvement in 8 Fingers, whether it be gambling with them, or working for them, or trading with them, or protecting them, is going to be arrested and their entire noble house dissolved. Whether it be the patriarch or their children. After that, I will be elevating new nobles. I know you asked for the rulership of Kani, and if you insist on that reward, I accept it. But I ask that you consider elevation to one of the larger estates. I will provide one to each of you, if that is all right. Princess Rena was more than pleased. Locked in her room, a curious-looking faceless man with 3 holes in his face, a winged succubus, and the more familiar demiurge, were tearing through documents as fast as their eyes could move. For the princess, it set her skin afire with excitement. Working with non-idiots is such an utter joy. Her black soul sang, pages were set aside, key points marked, and quills flew over paper as fast as the ink would run. Rena's dainty fingers turned dark at the tips from the ink stains, and yet there was no slowing down. The sound of pages flipping and being stacked up as arrest warrants were issued and evidence compiled for each and every conspirator was inspiring. Between the 4 of them, the completion of the task took the better part of a day. But it was done, and when it was done, Rena looked over the many individual stacks of paper and said, "This is a small town's worth of executions ahead." "Is that a problem?" the sultry dark-haired demoness asked. Rena shook her head. "No, Lady Albedo, not at all. We'll just have to hire a few new executioners is all. With my brothers out of the way and this? All I can say is. Rena stopped, moved from her chair to the floor, and flung herself prostrate to the trio. I pledge myself and my kingdom to the will of our shared master. And also, thank you for helping me today, it was a true pleasure. So she is as intelligent as you said, mein guter Demiurge. Pandora's actor said, and to that the Archdevil could only agree. Yes, she is. She will be useful in handing this box of jewels to our lord, Demiurge agreed, a fine bargain in exchange for one underfed puppy. Albedo's wings folded in around her body, the prostrate woman had yet to move, but the guardian overseer, acutely aware that her master had somehow changed, looked at the golden princess as much as a potential threat, as she did a useful tool. Yes, Albedo added, as long as she remembers her place, and doesn't seek elevation beyond her station. Everything will be fine. Rena chose not to answer, her answer, she knew, lay in her behavior. Finish the rest yourself, Albedo said with a sweet, matronly voice, and you will get everything you desire. Then the gate opened, and one by one the trio left the princess alone. When word of the job reached them as was intended, days passed like hours as Foresight spread rumors and stories of the wealth that lay ahead. Imina's elven heritage proved useful, telling stories from her father who had heard stories from his father's father centuries before of a powerful lord of greed who hoarded fortunes in his tomb. Stories of powerful artifacts spread among the rumor mills of the worker bars and taverns. But through it all, they searched for any hint of the missing arch. In the end, meeting in private on the day of departure, Hecarim could only rub his forehead and say, "We've done our best. All we can do now is hope it's enough. Listen to me." He looked from Imina to Robber Dyke, "The woman who kicked my ass, she looked human, but I don't think she was someone that strong. I'd have heard a rumor of at least. Adventurer or worker, there's no way someone like that just exists without me hearing about it. In other circumstances I'd think she was a foreigner, maybe from the theocracy, but the look on her face. No, she's not human. If she's not in charge there, who knows what kind of monsters we'll face. Remember what I told you," she said. "If we fail to rescue Arch." Imina touched his arm and looked up at her lover's eyes. "Don't think about that. We're Foresight, we've survived terrible things, we'll survive this too. And when it comes down to it, you'll do the right thing." That was the end of the discussion. The fast-spreading rumors brought scores of teams together outside the tomb, making the gathering space on the outskirts look more like the beginnings of a village than a temporary camp. A few of the usual sorts came along for the trip, camp followers and traveling merchants eager for a chance to profit off the life-risking efforts of the workers who expected a lot of coins burning holes in their pockets. "We did a really good job with those rumors at least," he said, looking around the lively, previously empty landscape. It was the largest gathering of workers that any of them had ever seen. "Parpatra, good to see you," Hecarim said beneath the light of a full moon. The pair clasped hands. The wrinkled old man, though in his 70s, seemed as vigorous as Hecarim recalled. "Dragon Hunt is ready to plunge into the darkness again, is it?" the leader of Foresight asked of his counterpart. Despite having the strength of a man in younger years, Parpatra's voice betrayed his age. "Well, dragons are a greedy lot, and when we get word of treasure to be had, we have to fly to where it can be found. How could we miss this chance?" The old man teased. At his back the rest of his team of humans chuckled and tapped their weapons, voicing silent agreement. "I guess that's true," Hecarim agreed. The sound of crunching dirt underfoot caused him to turn around. He glanced down to see the short, stocky body of Gringham, leader of Heavy Masher. As broad as he was short, Gringham made up for his size with having considerable strength and wearing thick armor over powerful muscles. It was often rumored that he had dwarven blood in his ancestry. His fondness for beer, heavy weapons, and love of dark underground places hinted at it along with his height. Middle-aged and swarthy with a pug nose and dark beard, Gringham's voice was deep and gravelly. "Hecarim, Parpatra. That man is here too." Though rough, he kept his voice to a whisper. "Hecarim, try to keep Imina from him, he's been at it again with his elf slaves for a while now." Hecarim cocked his ear, and then he caught it, a very tiny hint of crying. He grimaced. "Iria's Ruth of Tenmu. That scum. It's a different set from last time too, I guess. The others were lost," Gringham added. Hecaran blinked several times. He knew what the short leader of Heavy Masher meant. Iria was a powerful swordsman from the slain theocracy who took human supremacy seriously. His personality was so disagreeable that despite being compared to Gazif Stranov, he couldn't find or form a team, and so he bought mentally broken elf slaves to provide magical backup. He only ever purchased female elves, and he never properly armed or equipped them in any way, nor were they spared his advances when there was free time. Scum. Hecaran thought again. The leering-eyed the blonde swordsman turned on Imina, and his contempt for her half-elven ancestry. It brought lingering hatred that was made worse by virtue of the fact that the leader of Foresight knew he couldn't defeat Tenmu if it came down to it. Maybe if I'm lucky, he'll encounter the blonde monster that put me down. There's a cheerful thought. It was enough to perk the leader of Foresight up, so Hecaran changed the subject and did his best to ignore the distant cries. You brought all 14 members this time? Gringham grunted. Aye, we were going to go on another job soon. If we had, hey, I'd only have brought a small team this time. Thank goodness for small favors. I hear this tomb is big. He turned his eyes to the place. It had large columns that towered overhead and a great open courtyard in front of it. The stone roof appeared to be marble and carved by extraordinarily gifted artisans. I've heard the same, but... Patra stroked his wizened old chin. I don't recognize anything we've seen of it so far. Not the symbol carved on the outer stones, and not the design. I've seen a lot of ruins, but never anything quite like this. The world is a big place, and we know there were a lot of things that were lost in the collapse 600 years ago. Who knows? Hecaran shrugged it off. For all we know, the collapse 600 years ago wasn't even the first of its kind. Perhaps this is from an even earlier age. Patra tapped the butt of his spear on the ground. That's possible, we know so little about those days. He looked away from his fellow team leaders. A number of other worker teams were forming camp and getting ready for the exploration the next day. A lot of people took up this job. I hope there's enough treasure to go around. Patra added. He didn't look up when there was a particularly despairing scream from the tent of the team Tenmu. Well, we could come to a kind of collective agreement, the three of us. Whatever our teams find, we all agree to divvy up accordingly, Gringham said. His voice went up a little to drown out the dying wail at his back. You have 14 members, Hecaran has only 4, and I have the same. That's not really an even split no matter how you slice it. Patra pointed out while stroking his short white beard. Speaking of 4, I haven't seen that pretty little one, the blonde caster. Arch, is she around? She's close by, Hecaran said with a cough and shifted the subject back to the matter at hand by turning to Gringham and adding, our very ancient old friend here is right. You'd get a lot more shares than we would out of a deal like that. Ah, what if we go in first, and take the biggest risk as compensation? Gringham pitched, and that was enough. Agreed, Patra said, and Hecaran could only nod. Is this really worth it? Hecaran asked. Just gold? I mean? Gringham grunted. Yeah, gold is life, it's what we strive for, you know that. And we'll take it any way it comes. Even if we have to work with, he jabbed his thumb over his shoulder, a different voice began to wail like the first. That. Hecaran walked away with a mute, dead-eyed stare to return to his comrades in their own small tent. When this is over, he said, after we've saved Arch, I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. It's pointless. Robert Ike sighed. My friend, the middle-aged cleric answered, I've toyed with the same thought many times. I've only stuck with this as long as I have because of who I work with. If we part ways, I'll find a village somewhere and settle down as a local priest. That will be good enough for me. I go where you go, even if that means no more tombs or caves, Imina said instantly, but first we rescue Arch. I pray to the gods she's all right. What if they're torturing her? What if they're... She tried not to think of the other possibilities and tuned out the suffering of an elven woman in the Tenmu tent. Don't think about it, most monsters aren't interested in humans like that. At least, just get some rest. Tomorrow we get started, and hopefully it all works out, Hecaran said, and went to his bedroll to collapse into ugly dreams.